The ground shook before the horns even sounded, and I knew something had gone wrong. My name is Dane, and I was standing on a ridge of black stone on a planet I still could not pronounce correctly, watching an army of 7-foot-tall warriors freeze in place, because nobody had told them this fight was allowed to start yet. I was not supposed to be near the front line. I was logistics. I carried crates, fixed broken radios, and stayed out of the way while the Arendari coalition fought their long, slow, ceremonial wars with rules older than my entire species. They had a code for everything. Weapons were carried by attendants, not warriors. Battles began with a formal call. Even retreat had its own sacred rhythm. It was beautiful, in a strange and rigid way, and it was about to fall apart in front of me. The attack came from the tree line without warning, without a horn, without the ritual challenge their laws demanded. Raiders poured out of the dark in lines that did not care about anyone's customs. The Arendari soldiers around me did the one thing their training had never prepared them for. They hesitated, spears half raised, eyes searching for officers who were too far back to help, shields lowered because nobody had given the order to lift them. I did not have a weapon. They had taken it from me that morning for some cleansing ritual I still did not fully understand, and nobody had given it back yet. I had a radio clipped to my belt, a multi-tool in my pocket, and absolutely nothing that resembled a gun. I want to be clear that I did not decide to do what happened next. There was no plan. My legs simply moved before my brain caught up, and I was running toward the fighting instead of away from it, which even I will admit is not a good habit. A raider swung a long curved blade at a young Arendari soldier who was still trying to remember which hand his shield went on. I grabbed a fallen banner pole off the ground, snapped it against my knee, and used the jagged end to knock the blade sideways. The raider stumbled. I did not stop to admire my own work. I kicked his legs out from under him, took the sidearm from his belt before he hit the ground, and turned it on the next attacker coming through the smoke. 3 shots. 3 attackers slowed just enough for the soldiers behind me to remember they were holding shields. I heard someone shout my name from the ridge. It was Hallie, my sergeant, and his voice had the particular tone of a man watching his career end in real time. I did not have time to explain myself to him. There was a raider climbing the rocks to my left, and I had nothing left in the gun. I threw it at his face, which startled him more than it hurt him, and that was enough. I tackled him into a pile of broken crates, took his short blade, and kept moving. This is the part where I admit my plan, such as it was, kept changing every 4 seconds. I found a cracked comm unit on the ground, still sparking, and threw it into a cluster of raiders regrouping near a supply line. It was not a grenade. It was just an old radio. But it sparked and smoked exactly like something dangerous, and 3 grown warriors scattered like startled birds. I almost laughed, but laughing felt like a good way to get stabbed. Somewhere above me, on the high ridge where the coalition leaders watched the field, stood the one person who was not supposed to be paying attention to a logistics corporal making questionable decisions with a stolen blade. Her name was Valith, and she was the heir to the Arendari crown, though I did not know that yet. All I knew, glancing up for half a second, was that there was a tall figure in dark ceremonial armor standing completely still, while everyone around her gestured and shouted. She was watching only me. I did not have time to wonder why. A raider grabbed my shoulder from behind and I spun, drove my elbow into his ribs and shoved him into a support beam that had been holding up a supply tent. The tent collapsed on him, which was not elegant, but it worked. The fighting moved fast after that. I climbed a low crystal formation because it was the only clear path away from 3 more attackers, and from up there I could finally see the shape of the battlefield. The raiders had broken formation completely, scattering into pockets instead of pushing forward as one line. I shouted down to the nearest Arendari officer, a broad-shouldered woman named Orsa, and pointed toward the gap where their attack was thinning. She understood the gesture even without my words. Her warriors surged forward into that gap, and for the first time since the attack began, the coalition line started to hold instead of crumble. I lost my footing coming down from the rocks and landed hard on my side. A rib protested loudly. I ignored it because that seemed like the only sensible option at the time. By the time the last raiders fled into the tree line, the sun had barely moved. The whole thing had taken minutes, though it had felt much longer. I sat on a broken crate, missing one boot, my side aching, holding a blade that was not mine, and finally allowed myself to breathe. Hallie reached me first, his face somewhere between relief and disbelief. "You walked into that without a weapon," he said, not really asking. "I did not have one," I told him. Seemed like a bad reason to stand around. He stared at me the way people stare at something they are trying to decide whether to be proud of or terrified by. "That," he said slowly, "is exactly the kind of sentence that gets you written up in 3 different reports. I was still trying to think of a clever reply when I noticed the warriors nearby had stopped talking. Several of them were looking at me with an expression I had not seen from the Arendari before. Not suspicion, not curiosity, something closer to reverence, which made me deeply uncomfortable, because all I had actually done was improvise badly and get lucky. Commander Sorth arrived a moment later, his expression unreadable, his pace controlled and sharp. He looked at me, then at the discarded sidearm near my feet, then at the soldiers who had survived the gap I had pointed out. "You broke protocol," he said. "There was no protocol left to follow," I answered. Everyone else froze. I did not have that option. He studied me for a long moment, and I genuinely could not tell whether he was about to commend me or have me removed from the planet. Before he could decide, a new voice cut through the tension, calm and steady, carrying the kind of authority that made even Sorth straighten his shoulders. It was Vaylith. She had come down from the ridge without announcement, without guards stepping ahead of her, which apparently was not something she normally did. She walked straight past Sorth and stopped in front of me. Up close, she was taller than I expected, with sharp amber eyes that seemed to be cataloging every detail of the mess I had become. "You entered battle with no weapon," she said. It was not a question, but I answered anyway. "I did not have time to get one," I said. It was not bravery. It was bad timing. She tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they hear an answer that does not match what they expected. "Among my people," she said, "a warrior without a weapon retreats. It is law. It is survival. You did the opposite, and you did not even seem to consider retreating as an option." I did not have a good response to that, so I told her the truth. "Running felt slower than fighting," I said. "That is the whole reason." Something shifted in her expression then, something small and difficult to name. Sorth opened his mouth to say something else about protocol, but she raised one hand without looking at him, and he closed it again. "I want to see how your kind trains," she said to me. "Tomorrow." I glanced at Hallie, who gave me a look that clearly meant, "Do not say anything strange," and then I looked back at her. "I can arrange that," I said, which felt like the safest possible sentence. She studied me a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the ridge without another word, leaving behind a silence that Hallie broke almost immediately. "Do you have any idea what just happened?" he asked. I genuinely did not, and I told him so. The next morning, true to her word, Vaylith appeared at our training ground, just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. She wore simpler armor this time, still elegant, but clearly meant for movement rather than ceremony. She stood at the edge of our makeshift course, arms crossed, watching as my squad ran through drills that probably looked ridiculous to someone used to ritual combat. I demonstrated a basic grappling hold on one of our newer soldiers, a quiet young man named Eli, talking through the mechanics as I went. Weight distribution, leverage, how a smaller frame could redirect a larger opponent's force instead of meeting it head-on. "Show me," Vaylith said. I hesitated only a second before stepping toward her, explaining each movement as I guided her through the hold. Her balance was different from anything I had trained against, and halfway through the demonstration she shifted her weight in a way I had not expected, and I lost my grip entirely. She caught herself before falling, recovering with the kind of grace that made the mistake look intentional. I apologized immediately, certain I had just insulted royalty in front of half my unit. She straightened, studying her own hand for a moment as though it had done something unfamiliar. "Do that again," she said. We ran the drill 3 more times. By the 3rd attempt, she had adjusted to the technique entirely, countering it in a way that left me on the ground instead of her. My squad tried very hard not to laugh, and mostly failed. That afternoon, the alarm sounded again. A second raid, smaller than the first but faster, hit our eastern perimeter before scouts could even report movement. This time I had a weapon, finally returned to me after the cleansing rites had run their course, but somehow I still ended up using a combat knife, and a length of raider cable I improvised into a tripwire instead. We held the perimeter without losing ground. When it was over, Sorth approached me with the same unreadable expression from the day before, except this time there was something sharper underneath it. "You were issued a proper weapon," he said. "You barely used it." "The knife worked," I said. "The cable worked better." He shook his head slowly, somewhere between frustration and grudging respect, and walked away without another word. That evening, the Coalition Council gathered to review the engagement, and Sorth raised the matter of my unconventional methods in front of the entire group, clearly intending to have me reprimanded for ignoring standard procedure twice in 2 days. Before the council could respond, Vaylith stood. "The humans' methods are unconventional," she said, "but they are not reckless. He reads the field as it changes, not as it was planned. That is a skill, not a flaw. The room went quiet in a way that told me, even without understanding their customs fully, that something significant had just happened. Sorth said nothing further. The council moved on to other matters, but Hallie leaned close to me afterward, his voice low. "Do you understand what she just did?" he asked. I told him I did not really. "In Arendari law," he said, "when someone of her rank publicly defends a warrior against formal criticism, it is treated as a personal endorsement. It is not small. It is one of the highest honors a commoner outside their people can receive." I sat with that for a long while after the council ended, turning it over in my mind the way you turn over something heavy and unfamiliar, trying to find the part that makes sense. I thought about every reason this made no sense. She was the heir to a planet I would probably never fully understand. I was a corporal who fixed radios and occasionally improvised his way through chaos. There were 100 careful arguments against whatever this was becoming. Then I thought about the way she had looked at her own hand after losing her balance in training, like she had encountered something unexpected and was not yet ready to name it. I stopped listing reasons after that. 2 days later, the largest assault yet came from the northern pass, catching both our forces off guard with sheer numbers. I found myself fighting beside Valeth without either of us planning it, simply ending up in the same gap in the line as raiders pressed forward from 2 directions at once. We did not fight the same way. She moved with precise, trained discipline, every strike measured. I moved the way I always did, adjusting on instinct, using whatever was within reach. Somehow, despite the difference, we read each other perfectly. When she stepped left, I covered the gap she left behind without thinking about it. When I stumbled, she was already moving to close the space before I even regained my footing. When the last raider fell and the field went quiet, we were standing back to back in the middle of the wreckage, both breathing hard, neither of us speaking for a long moment. "You fought differently today," she said finally. "So did you," I answered. She turned to face me, and for the first time since I had met her, there was no formality in her expression at all. "I recognized something in you the first day," she said. "The day you walked into battle with nothing in your hands. My people have a word for it. It means the recognition of a kindred fighting spirit. I have never spoken it aloud to anyone before today." I stood there for a moment, covered in dust, missing a boot for the second time that week, trying to process what she had just told me. "So let me get this straight," I said. "You fell for me on the day I was unarmed, barefoot, and stealing weapons off the ground." "That is an accurate summary," she said, clearly unaware of how strange that sounded out loud. I told her it was the nicest thing anyone had ever said about me, and when she did not understand why that was funny, I explained the joke as best I could. And she laughed, a short surprise sound that her own adjutant later described as something none of them had ever heard from her before. The formal ceremony came a week later, after the coalition finished its review of the engagements and decided, somewhat reluctantly in Sorth's case, that unconventional methods had saved more lives than they had endangered. I stood through the recognition with as much composure as I could manage, which was not much, while Valeth stood beside me representing the crown. When it ended and we walked out together into the cool evening air, she reached over and took my hand without a word, the way someone does when the gesture feels obvious rather than uncertain. I was unarmed again, in the way that mattered most, and for the first time, I did not see that as a problem at all. She held my hand the way someone holds something they have already decided to keep.